Well, I'm curious, you, as an expert in naval strategy, what would you wager to guess is the Chinese Communist Party's plan with its now largest navy in the world, how they're planning to affect global shipping lanes in the South China Sea, their plans for Taiwan? What do you think their strategy could be?
I don't mean to be flippant, but the common response to that is they want to win without fighting, and I think that's probably true. Who wouldn't? But let me suggest that you should have on your show an old friend of mine who's really, really smart and very experienced and has really climbed the ladder. His name is Randy Shriver. He's the chairman of the founder and now the chairman after his stint as Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia of the Project 2049. And he says he shares with discussants the Pentagon, while he was in the Pentagon, the secret plan for figuring out China. And this is important, and I'll get to the reason why in a minute. He says, here's a secret plan. I'm going to share it with you. And everybody says, okay, and they get their pen out, a new fresh piece of paper. Say, you listen to what they say, you read what they write, and you watch what they do. Now, is it more complicated than that? Of course. But it's not that much more complicated than that.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting you say that, because if like some of the things that I've noticed by looking at, what they've published is like basically their warfare strategy is they consider themselves to be at war with the United States already, right? And they're
if you read what they say and listen to what they say,
their unconventional warfare strategies, like they're all really out there. Yeah, but of course the conversation when it comes to China in Congress and in the media generally does not address those things.
Look, this is a terrible conundrum for the United States. Every military officer since, I don't know when, since war colleges were founded, have taught what Clausewitz said, which is war is a continuation of policy by other means. Now, what that means is that peace is the normal situation, and war is an interruption of that normalcy, right? So after the war, we'll get back to peace and we'll continue those policies. This is what the Western canon teaches. It's analysts, it's serving officers, it's strategists, and so on. The Chinese idea is completely the opposite. It's that we're always at war, and once in a while, peace breaks out. So this is a terrible problem for us because we simply can't believe it. Not only does it contradict everything we've been taught, but it goes against our grain because why? What are we? We're liberal Democrats. I don't mean political party. I mean the liberal democratic order. That's what we believe in. We believe in maintaining the peace. Well, it's a hell of a note when the guy you're trying to talk to or influence has a completely different worldview. So this is why one of the first things that we have to get a lot better at is understanding the Chinese. Now, I don't mean to say that it's as simple as Randy Shriver makes out. He's not trying to deceive anybody. He's brilliant in his simplicity. I will tell you, however, that very, very senior military officers, the two worst days of my professional life have been when two different times, widely separated in time, very senior people have said, we just can't figure the Chinese out.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because, you mentioned like how we view war and peace in the West, and like China is run by communists, right? And like the fundamental tenets of Marxism and what China is now, which is Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, Xi Jinping thought with Chinese characteristics for a new era, et cetera. But that core of Marxism is about struggle, right? And the idea is that communism is based on continual struggle. And like the communists cannot have a period without some kind of struggle. And this is true internally in China because they're always going after, the party is always struggling against an internal group, right? Whether it's the rightists or the intellectuals, the landlords, later the democracy students, later it was Falun Gong, now it's the Uyghurs, it'll be some new group now, right? And that's kind of how their political system actually functions, right? It's based on that struggle. And I think our inability to understand struggle from that Marxist perspective makes us think that that we could have a kind of peace with them.
Shelley, I think you need to sign Matt up for a segment of this show, an interview.
That's what I've been saying.
I mean, I think it is not just that we fundamentally misunderstand the political system of China too. I think it's that we kind of want the rest of the world to be like us.
I mean, we are pretty great.
I think you're right, Matt, in that we definitely misunderstand that what the Chinese Communist Party is, but also the Chinese Communist Party, they've been saying the right things since the 90s, right? In terms of like, oh yeah, like when everybody was arguing that we should help China join the WTO because they, we'll get them on the economy first. They'll liberalize the economy, then they'll liberalize politically. They didn't say, oh no, we're not interested in that. They're like, yeah, sure, definitely.
It'll totally force us to liberalize politically. Absolutely.
And, kind of similarly, when Vladimir Putin first came to power, there was a lot of glowing press for him in the US media. And the idea was that like, oh, here's this, okay, sure, he was in the KGB, but he says all the right things. He might even want to join the EU or NATO. Like he said, yeah, sure, when he was asked about that. Like it's just that they've just been able to, say the right things, and we don't we kind of want to trust them.
Right. I mean, and was about 10 years ago, we did the big Russia reset, or attempted to kind of like fix that relationship because we had this level of trust. I mean,
you mean when we used the wrong word in Russian, that Russian reset?
I didn't know about that.
Yeah.
That sums it up perfectly if that's the case.
Exactly. I'm a little bit more cynical than you are, Shelley. I think that a lot of this can be explained eventually, historically, in terms of wanting strong men in charge of China and Russia so that there wouldn't be any problems emerging. Well, the trouble is you can't have one without the other. I think we're learning that now.
So then what is the next step? We have Putin talking about nukes invading Ukraine. We have China promising to invade Taiwan. It has the largest navy in the world. What's next?
I think we have to get ready for the long game. The ethic of the Navy strategic planners that I admire, and the presidents and the other military planners and secretaries of defense and so on, who I admire, all understood that if we actually went to war during the Cold War, that everybody would lose. I think President Eisenhower once said something to the effect that the survivors would envy the dead, and that we had to work really hard to deter, not to give in, obviously, because the record is clear on that, but that we had to work really hard to deter. Well, that requires a certain strength of character, and let's assume that we still have that. But we don't have the institutional, or organizational, or physical capabilities that we once had, first of all. Second, this is the first time that a single competitor can virtually match us in terms of economic power. I think the statistic is that during World War II, combined GDP of Germany, Japan, and Italy was something like, I can't remember, but it doesn't make a difference at this level, that it was either 40% or 60% of our GDP. Well, they couldn't possibly compete under those circumstances. That's not the case with China now. So I think this is going to be a long road to hoe. I think that strategies that we put in place now are going to be key because they're going to affect everything else that happens. Not that the strategies don't change. Strategies during the Cold War changed. But you have to pretty much get it right at the outset. In the meantime, we've got a real emergency. The barn is on fire in Ukraine. And there's a great disagreement now in the vernacular press and in American analysis whether Putin is in his right mind or not. I personally think he's a maniac, a lunatic, and a megalomaniac, and everything that goes with that, and therefore he's very unstable. This just makes it more difficult. It makes it a difficult proposition, almost, but hopefully not quite impossible. In the meantime, we've got the Chinese. And I think there's been a lot of talk, a lot of writing, some very thoughtful observations about Europe and Russia, Ukraine, NATO, and how to respond to that. There's been far less written about and discussed regarding how all this plays out with regard to Xi Jinping, who I think is also a megalomaniac, who wants to change the world no matter what. You know, he has choices. He has choices every day on how he's going to treat his own citizens and how he's going to look at and comport with the rest of the world. And he keeps making choices that are antithetical to our interests. But I also think antithetical to I believe the constants of the aspirations of human rights and the rule of law, free trade, and so on. So this is, we could probably, Grant Newsham has been on your show. Grant Newsham, in the context of this AUKUS submarine deal between the US, the UK, and Australia, said, you know, the navies are sitting down for an 18-month kind of, let's decide what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. And he conducted that enterprise in print based on what some really savvy naval officers said. But I think they were Australian, by the way, not American. Said, yeah, we could do this. We could have that part of it done in an afternoon, not in 18 months. So I think that this strategic planning, which hopefully is going on now, it just isn't that complicated. You have to have a hook so that you'll get people's attention. You have to be able to be articulate enough to convince people. But the likes of Carl Vinson and Tom Hayward and John Lehman, they were able to work with presidents. The success of the maritime strategy depended upon Ronald Reagan declaring in a meeting, he sort of interrupted the conversation. And he said something to the effect of, well, I understand that there's some people who are opposed to the Navy's 600-ship maritime strategy. I'm in favor of it. Is anybody here opposed to it? Well, you can imagine, you could have heard a pin drop in the room when that occurred, and that was it. That was the end of the argument. And then things happened, as I've described, and as others have described far better than I can. So getting the attention of the leadership, in my view, is a Navy responsibility, just as it is for the Army and just as it is for the Department of Commerce and so on. And of course, the problem, the real world problem, is that you've only got one president and you've got every department and every secretary and every constituency clawing at them, pulling on their sleeve, and they have to choose. They have to choose what their priorities are going to be. In the present instance, it may be that Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping are setting those priorities. And it's more apparent than ever that that's, in fact, the reality. So this is a very tough American political problem. Why? Because half the country wants nothing to do with any of this. The country is split right down the middle in terms of domestic policy. And when you're having a fight domestically, it's hard to think over the parapet. It's hard to even look out, let alone come up with plans and capabilities and investments that are going to deal with something that's, well, it's over the horizon, it's over there. Let's not worry about it. Let's get back to the divisiveness of American politics. And by the way, I say that as a non-political statement, but that's just the reality of where we are now. So it makes it doubly, triply difficult. The world wasn't like that in 1940, despite the fact that ostensibly isolation was American national policy. The world wasn't like that throughout the Cold War, despite the fact that there were plenty of fights. The way the Vietnam War ended was as political as anything, because it coincided with the demise of President Nixon and so on. So we are missing that component of any palpable, discernible unity useful in the context of national security, which, in other words, internationally. And everybody knows it. Tokyo knows it. Delhi knows it. Brussels knows it. Moscow knows it. Beijing knows it, and so on. Anybody who counts knows it. So there are no guarantees. We're used to being kind of in charge. We're used to being successful. And anybody who looks around can see how that's not working out so well for us these days. So dealing with China, building up the Navy or not, so on, all of these things are very much on the table, but definitely unresolved.